Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 111 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. We are returning to the US of A this week to once again have a fascinating chat with our good friend, Dr. Jerrod Brown. Jerrod is a frequent contributor to the program. If you have not already heard any of his past episodes, I encourage you to go back and check those out. He has talked to us in the past as to a variety of topics, including that of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and he also did a 3-part series on the topic of all things trauma related. Also did a fascinating interview on the subject of low self-regulation. And of course, we did a case profile of the infamous serial killer, Albert Fish. And in fact, we have some Albert Fish updates for those of you who are intrigued by that episode. For those who have not had the opportunity to hear Jerrod on this show before, allow me to share a bit of his professional experience with you all. Jerrod Brown, PhD, is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health and a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies for Concordia University right here in St. Paul, Minnesota. In addition to this experience, Jerrod has provided consultation services to a number of caregivers, professionals, and organizations pertaining to topics related to autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, confabulation, suggestibility, trauma and other life adversities, traumatic brain injury, and youth fire setting. Today, Jerrod is here to introduce us to the topic of Alexithymia. I suspect many of you have never heard that term before. But that being said, I suspect many of you will wish to learn more about this topic after hearing my interview with Dr. Brown. Simply put, Alexithymia can be defined as the inability to recognize or describe one's own emotions. Now just reflect on that for a moment or two, if you would. The inability to recognize or describe one's own emotions. If you are a human services professional, what are some implications that could arise from your clients fitting into this definition? Well, let's not spend too much time noodling over that, as I know Dr. Brown is going to take us on a wonderful journey of discovery as to this topic. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Jerrod Brown, joining us from the capital city of St. Paul in my home state of Minnesota, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome back to the show, Dr. Brown. Jerrod has graced us with his presence in the past on the show. We love to talk to Dr. Brown because he talks about things outside of perhaps those traditional approaches that we take to interacting with and supervising justice-involved individuals. So today we're going to talk about Alexithymia. Why don't we maybe, Jerrod, kick it off talking about what is Alexithymia, and then we're going to maybe bring it closer to home as to why this pertains to criminal justice professionals a bit later on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me back, my friend. Honored to be here and hope all of you are doing well today. So this term alexithymia, I think it's a term that most criminal justice professionals and mental health professionals and human service, social service professionals haven't heard of, at least in my experience, just talking to people. I give lots of talks on this topic to different audiences. And it is one of the most important topics that we can understand and should understand if you work with people. Alexithymia is really a threat to emotional health and well-being. So if you're working with any clients that are dealing with severe mental health problems, addiction tendencies, trauma, brain injuries, criminal justice involvement, the research is absolutely clear on this, that rates of alexithymia are higher in those populations. Alexithymia is not a disorder, but really think of it as a deficit or like a personality trait or like a psychological impairment where the person you're working with basically has no words for feelings. It's emotional kind of competency deficit where the person is going to have lower levels of emotional awareness. It can absolutely impact that person's ability to communicate their emotions with other people. So if you are running a group, you're a therapist, whatever you do, it is an absolute threat to treatment, group interventions. There have been several studies now that are pretty clear on this, that alexithymia, if gone unnoticed and unaddressed, is a risk factor for criminal behavior. There have been several studies that have looked at alexithymia within the context of violent behavior, aggression, sexual offending, juvenile delinquency. The list goes on and on and on. So when we think of this, it's like a subclinical trait. That's just a fancy way of saying, again, it's not its own disorder, but it's a deficit that co-occurs with so many different other disorders. So let's break this down a little bit more. If somebody has alexithymia, they typically think in very concrete manners. So abstract reasoning is limited. Perspective taking is often limited. The research also leans to the fact that it can really get in the way of social and interpersonal competence and have a negative impact on like social attachment patterns as well. So basically, if you're working with someone who has alexithymia, they're going to have a difficult time naming, labeling, describing, processing, and understanding emotions in themselves and often in other people. So if you are sitting with a client face-to-face, regardless of whatever you're doing, and if you're working with someone that has true alexithymia, there's a good chance that you as the professional can see visually that your client might be in distress. Maybe there's something wrong. They look frustrated. They look sad. They seem highly irritable. But that client has a very difficult time naming and connecting their outward feelings and body sensations to their internal emotions. So there's a big disconnect between when the client's really angry, upset, depressed, to be able to tell another person, I'm feeling upset today, I'm feeling sad. So there's a big disconnect there. They can come off very rigid. Sometimes they can come off very cold and callous. So if you're working with a defendant who has alexithymia, in some cases, if that defendant's sitting in a courtroom, they could come off as very cold and rigid and callous when in fact that's not their intent. They might be dealing with this deficit. So it can absolutely get in the way of a lot of things. Alexithymia has also been linked to impulse control problems, self-regulation deficits, substance misuse, and in some cases too, people with alexithymia may have a real difficult time really looking at other people's facial expressions. So they may get, basically when they're looking at someone and someone's really excited, they may mix that up and their brain tells them that that person's really angry or vice versa. So there can be a real disconnect on how that person processes information in the social arena. So again, alexithymia has been associated with so many psychiatric disorders, medical, neurological, and even psychosomatic disorders. Psychosomatic disorders are going to be like those medically unexplained symptoms. Fibromyalgia comes to mind, chronic fatigue syndrome. Maybe this is not uncommon. You might have this sometimes where the client is like having a panic attack or feeling like they're having a heart attack. They go to the hospital. Doctors can't find anything wrong with them. All those emotions go in, and it really can impact their medical health. If you work with clients with eating disorders, fascinatingly, a very high percentage of people with eating disorders also deal with co-occurring alexithymia. If you work with violent offenders, if you work with people with extensive trauma histories, people who have an extensive history of disassociation or self-injurious behavior or suicide risk, alexithymia has absolutely been found to co-occur with those populations significantly more than the general population. Joe, I'll stop for a minute, see if you have any thoughts or questions.
Jerrod, lots of thoughts, lots of questions as you were speaking there, some things we should maybe go back and unpack. You were mentioning, among other things, impulsivity, self-regulation deficits. And those are, when we start talking about criminogenic factors, you're starting to tiptoe up to that neighborhood. You even mentioned substance abuse, which is clearly a criminogenic factor. And I know you mentioned co-occurring disorders as well. So from a practitioner looking at this through, let's just say, for example, the risk-need responsivity lens, and they've trained themselves again to recognize and address these established criminogenic factors. What are some issues here, for lack of a better term, with some of these manifestations of alexithymia, sort of not parroting or mimicking, but again, flat out, like you said, impulsivity, self-regulation deficits? Should we care about that distinction or not? Or should it be treated just as criminogenic factors would be?
I think going as deep as possible with this topic, this is just my own opinion. This is one of the most important topics all criminal justice and mental health professionals need to know about, but don't know about because there's not a lot of training out there. However, there's a lot of studies that have been published on this, but as far as I know, there is little training opportunity on this topic out there. Alexithymia has been associated with depression, anxiety, anger control issues, lack of empathy, poor coping skills, drug and alcohol use, caffeine addiction, tobacco addiction, gambling addiction. It's higher in people with schizophrenia, autism, neurodegenerative disorders, chronic pain issues. The list goes on and on and on. And alexithymia has been studied within the context of so many different deficits and disorders. Just a few to think about. In the criminal justice system, most people in prison have had extensive trauma histories. A big cause for alexithymia in the literature is experiencing extensive trauma early in childhood. Not everyone that's had extensive trauma will have alexithymia, but it's very high in that population. This topic has also been studied within the context of traumatic brain injury. And if you look at the research on traumatic brain injury in the criminal justice system, around 50 to 60, even higher percentage-wise of people who have been in prison have had a history of brain injury, if you believe what the research says. This research is also leaning to the fact that it is possibly a contributing factor to inappropriate sexual behavior. So if you're working in sex offender treatment, learning about this topic is going to be very, very helpful because alexithymia contributes to empathy deficits, perspective taking, intimacy problems, all of those factors that are often taken into account within those sex offender treatment programs. I've come across one article, Joe, that talked about if someone is court-ordered or really recommended to take part in restorative justice, alexithymia can absolutely complicate that process because alexithymia when introduced into any situation that requires that person to have a lot of insight into their emotions and being able to name, label, process their emotions, you have to be able to do that in a restorative justice context. If you are, again, in maybe you're court ordered to a COG skills group, a lot of those COG skills groups are going to be asking people about their feelings, their thoughts, their emotions. There's an argument to be made that it's not going to go well for that person in that group.
Right.
And that can lead to a breakdown in the therapeutic relationship with the professional running the group. And then the professional running the group, if they don't understand alexithymia, is going to think this person is not wanting to be there and not wanting to self-disclose when in fact maybe that client can't because of this deficit.
You've twice now, Jerrod, noted limited perspective taking. And when I jotted that down on my notepad here, I also jotted down empathy deficits. And you just touched on that a lot. When I, again, train on various criminogenic assessments and I'm coaching folks on what to look for, and I'm telling them, yeah, it is what you're saying here, this inability to see the other perspective or this callousness. So again, I see a lot of these manifestations, if you will, popping up in other areas that we train in. We've been talking about these quite a bit, but are there any other red flag indicators and consequences associated with alexithymia?
Yeah, a ton. One thing I didn't mention, Joe, alexithymia is common in the general population. If you look at this research, around 10% of the general population deals with alexithymia on some level. It's more common in men. If you look at juvenile populations, some of the studies point to the fact that around 7 to almost 30% of adolescents may deal with alexithymia, according to the literature. Now, if we look at clinical populations, so clients that may be in mental health treatment, psychiatric inpatient or outpatient settings, the research there jumps it up to around 33 to 47% of people in those populations may be dealing with some level of alexithymia. If you look at substance use treatment programs, again, now keep in mind, general population around 10%. People with alcohol use disorders, they may be as high as 67% of people that have problems with alcohol use problems may have alexithymia, and around half the people that have substance use disorders may have alexithymia, according to the research. So I point that out because if you're working in addiction treatment, if you're a licensed alcohol drug counselor, you are coming into contact with people with alexithymia, probably 1 out of every 2 clients you have, if not more, if you believe what that research says. If any of you are working with problem gamblers, the research points to the fact that maybe as high as almost 45% of problem gamblers appear to have higher rates of alexithymia. So, and we know problem gambling and unfortunately criminal justice involvement sometimes go hand in hand. I've worked with a lot of problem gamblers over my life. So definitely something to think about. And Joe, I mentioned before traumatic brain injuries. 10% of the general population, if you start looking at brain injury clients, 30 to 60% of people with brain injuries may have alexithymia. If we look at the forensic literature on this, 10% in the general population, the forensic literature, the studies I've come across, really point to the fact between 31 and 47% of people who are in prison have alexithymia, according to this research literature. So again, when we look at this through a criminal justice, forensic, and legal lens, it has huge implications. And if you were to go through most of the studies written about this topic within the forensic realm, you're going to find studies that have looked at alexithymia within the context of memory for a crime. So if any of you are working in the field of like eyewitness suggestibility, eyewitness reliability, alexithymia could be a factor to take into account. If you work with clients, again, with self-harming behaviors, clients that engage in reactive aggression, if you're working in the juvenile justice arena, all of these things, all of these variables have been studied within this context. And Joe, through your R&R lens, there is some evidence to point to the fact that alexithymia, if gone untreated, can be a factor for ongoing criminal justice involvement. So there have been so many studies on this. And if you're working in domestic violence treatment, there's actually been several studies that have shown that alexithymia may be more common in survivors of domestic violence as well as perpetrators of domestic violence. So really incorporating an understanding of alexithymia into domestic violence treatment and intervention would be highly recommended. So if we think about this, why are we talking about this today? Again, it's common. And from a criminal justice lens or mental health lens, if you have a client that deals with alexithymia, there's a high likelihood that they turn to maladaptive coping patterns. They're going to have an increased difficulty coping with stress. Why is that the case? Because if we look at some of the stress literature, the intervention literature, being able to process our emotions and get those emotions out and share them with other people is so important for healing and recovery from so many things. If any of you are working as like a marriage and family therapist or working with couples, there's actually several studies too that have shown if one of the persons in the relationship has alexithymia, that can lead to breakdowns in the relationship, marriage. It contributes to more loneliness in the marriage, more issues, more conflict, more confusion, communication issues. If you're working with parents who are engaging in harsh disciplining practices, so maybe you're in child protection, child welfare, there's some evidence too that if parents have untreated alexithymia, they may be more likely to turn to harsh parenting practices during times of increased stress, anxiety, worry. So definitely something to take into account there. Interestingly too, alexithymia has been linked to skin disorders, psoriasis, diabetes, headaches, body pain, living a sedentary lifestyle, just people laying around all the time. That is so bad for one's health. It's been linked to sleep problems, internet gaming problems, peer victimization, even the ability to understand and appreciate humor has been linked to problems with alexithymia. And I've worked with a lot of clients who struggle with humor processing, where sometimes they think they come off funny, but they say things to other people that are not very nice. It leads to breakdowns in relationships, problems with employment. And we know if a client can't hold a job and they're on probation, that could lead to a technical violation. So there's a million things with this to consider, Joe.
Jerrod, I think it all starts with awareness, which you've been doing a great job of making us all aware of this. But something you said earlier about maladaptive behavior, and you also mentioned cognitive behavioral intervention implications, whether it's a group setting or a practitioner just engaging in one-on-one cognitive behavioral interventions. What are the implications there if the client suffers from alexithymia, and or what could that practitioner do to address that? Again, just beyond the awareness, what steps can one take?
Well, making things more concrete, because there is some evidence too that people with alexithymia are going to have some abstract reasoning deficits. So they're going to have a hard time understanding how and why questions. So if you're using insight-based approaches where you're asking them, how do you feel today? That is not going to work with a person like this. Making things very visual, concrete, skills building would be highly recommended. If you help them learn how to self-soothe, self-regulate, help them learn emotional regulation skills, so helping them develop more emotional awareness, emotional clarity. If they deal with some impulse control issues, helping them absolutely deal with that as well. Those would be a few things to take into account. When we think about like perceiving emotions in general, I think it's important too, if someone wants to really develop an increased awareness in this topic, look at emotional and social intelligence literature and maybe pulling out some of the intervention strategies from that literature. Anything you can do to strengthen executive functioning capabilities too. We've talked about that a lot, Joe, in other podcasts. Strengthening the CEO of the brain, that's basically executive function. So it's a lot of skills building. Helping them learn perspective taking. So what do you do about that? Maybe it's sitting with a client, teaching them, showing a feelings chart, making things visual. What does sadness actually look like and feel like? Maybe it's sitting with a client and you find a video online where someone is laughing or crying, watching that together and then talking about, what did you just see there? What did you feel there? What did you feel in your gut? What did you feel in your heart? What were you thinking in your head? Helping them connect the dots between body sensations and their emotions can be very helpful as well. Helping them get better sleep is so important. There's actually one study I came across that showed a link between this and possible lower levels of vitamin D. So I point that out. Get the client to their medical doctor for just routine and checkup. If you have clients that struggle with dental anxiety, I've come across a few studies that have shown that alexithymia could be a factor in some cases where the client just doesn't want to take care of their dental health. So there's a lot of factors to take into account here. So ask yourself a couple questions when we're looking at it through this lens. How does your client notice emotions? What's the way in which they notice? How do they understand? How do they label? Can they use emotions effectively to resolve conflict or get their point across to someone? And do they know how to recognize emotions in themselves and other people? If they don't in those areas, teaching them skills to help improve that would be very helpful. And if let's say you're a probation officer, these are red flag indicators you want to pick up on. Maybe it's a referral to like a qualified counselor who can dig deeper into this, because maybe the client's dealing with a lot of unresolved trauma too, and there's just a lot of layers going on here. If you're in substance use treatment, again, I mentioned before, a very high likelihood that if you're working with clients with extensive substance use problems or alcohol problems, they're probably dealing with some level of alexithymia. And if we look at this research, there's a lot of implications for substance use treatment. If alexithymia is going on with the client who's also using drugs and alcohol in their court order to treatment, the research leans to the fact that that person may be more likely to have a history of engaging in even more risky substance use that places them at greater risk of harm. They may be more likely to have more severe addictions and higher craving levels and an increased likelihood to drop out of treatment or relapse. And the research also leans to the fact that these folks may be more likely to have more extensive histories of substance use issues. So again, if you are in a substance use treatment program using insight-based or emotionally orientated types of approaches for that client, it's often not going to work, which it's a complete paradigm shift, because most people that work in these settings, you use these approaches, which work for a lot of clients. People with alexithymia, they may need some modifications. And if they're not aware of this topic, it can absolutely have a negative impact on the therapeutic engagement and alliance, and it can lead to a breakdown in their treatment goals. So just keep in mind when you're working with people with alexithymia, emotions can be very confusing to the individual. They can be very scary to the individual. Emotions can even be a mystery to that person. They just have no clue what's going on here. It can be overwhelming, and they can have a real difficult time managing their emotions. So I guarantee if you're working with people, you are working with clients with alexithymia on a regular basis.
Is there, maybe a silly question, Jerrod, is there a diagnosis for alexithymia, or is it more a matter of the practitioner observing these best practices that you've outlined sort of to be on the lookout for and then adjust your interactions accordingly?
When we look at It's important to obviously be aware of the red flag indicators, but there have been actually, surprisingly, several different screening instruments that have been developed for alexithymia. There's many of them. The gold standard one that is often cited in the literature is called the Toronto Alexithymia Scale, and it's actually been validated in at least one study for use with forensic populations. Some of these screening tools are going to be observational tools. Some are for adults, some are for kids, some are with families. But looking at the Toronto Alexithymia scale would be very helpful. In my experience, talking to a lot of mental health folks too, they don't use that tool. They're not aware of this topic. So I'm trying to get the awareness out that this is a real important topic, and learning about these screening tools and then starting to maybe screen for it, or at the very least, looking at the red flag indicators and at least being aware of it. And then starting to really explore your client's emotional states or the lack thereof. You might have the lack thereof where the client continually reports, I'm feeling tired, my eyes hurt, my back hurts, I'm just feeling weak. Are those medically based symptoms indicative of a lot of emotional distress that's locked up inside that client and they just can't seem to get it out? If you can help them gain more emotional awareness, understand their emotional state, so teaching them, okay, when you start feeling really warm in your body, your hands tingle, could that be a red flag indicator that you're starting to get irritable and now maybe there's a full-blown rage attack? And then helping them learn how to regulate their emotions. Maybe it's through deep breathing, exercise, walking. There's a lot of interventions that have been shown to be possibly helpful that pop up in this research literature. If you want, I can point a few out if that would be helpful.
When you mentioned that Toronto assessment scale, I could literally hear practitioners out there saying to themselves, oh, great, Joe, another screener, another assessment tool. But then I'm also wondering aloud here, when you mentioned some of these best practices, for example, using concrete examples, embracing a visual learning approach, getting at emotional regulation, or using emotional regulation skills, getting at those executive functioning deficits, there wouldn't be a great harm in using that regardless of the alexithymia presence or not. Again, I just don't want practitioners to get so hung up on thinking that it would be so bad to just sort of take some of these approaches regardless. Is that fair to say?
It is. I mean, you're not going to go wrong helping clients learn how to regulate emotions, get better sleep, live a healthier lifestyle. Mindfulness-based meditation approaches have been shown to be very helpful for this population. Journaling has been shown to be helpful in some cases. Expressive writing, focusing on teaching them how to manage stress more effectively. Being aware of psychoeducation too, the very nature of just educating clients about this has been shown in some studies to reduce some of these symptoms. So education is key. Education among the professionals is key because you're going to probably approach it in a different manner. You might not become frustrated. You might have more compassion and empathy, sympathy for the client, and then teaching the client's family members. There are a lot of different things out there, and we can't forget this. I'm actually putting together a training for another organization right now on alexithymia and burnout. I was shocked to learn how many studies have actually been published related to professional burnout and alexithymia. I am convinced at times I have dealt with symptoms of alexithymia. If we're dealing with high levels of stress, fatigue, just burnout, that can contribute to it as well. So just really being aware of self-care strategies, focusing on fatigue management too. Those are just a few things. And I've also come across a few studies that show that implementing self-compassion as well for a client, teaching that client to how to have some self-forgiveness, helping them just learn to let go of maybe mistakes they've made, have also been shown to be helpful for this population. So again, you bring up a good point, Joe. If the client doesn't have alexithymia, and if you use stress management strategies, self-compassion techniques, resilience-based approaches, that's good for anyone.
mention or talk more, Jerrod, about some of those self-care strategies when you brought up the fact that you've had suspicions, over the years that you're showing some of these signs yourself. I'm big on this show about breaking down the sort of binary approach we sometimes take in corrections, that us versus them. So it's great, I think, to highlight that this can be a consideration for professionals as well. Maybe expand on some of those self-care strategies, or again, things to address alexithymia.
Number one to health, in my opinion, is getting good restorative sleep. If someone is always burning the midnight oil, they're up half the night, they bring their work home with them, you're not getting restorative sleep, so you wake up the next day feeling groggy, tired. Some people might then pound the coffee and the caffeine and the sugar. That can lead to low-grade inflammation. Taking care of sleep, managing fatigue, taking breaks, getting outside in natural sunlight. If you're always inside in the dark, your brain is not getting that natural sunlight it so desperately needs, especially in the morning hours, to regulate our circadian rhythms, our sleep-wake cycle. If you are working all day at the office, come home and work all night long, you are increasing your cortisol levels. You're probably increasing your stress. It's throwing off your sleep. If you're looking at the screen late into the evening again, we're tricking our brains into saying, hey, stay up later. We're producing less melatonin. We're producing more cortisol. It's really activating our stress response system. Our main stress response system in our body is our HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. Deep breathing, exercise, being out in nature, just sitting in quiet. And I don't mean sitting in quiet watching a movie. Sitting in quiet and just slowing your mind down and taking space and setting good boundaries, taking breaks from work and taking time off on the weekends, being around animals, being around positive people, gardening, listening to relaxing music, getting a massage, acupuncture. I mean, the list goes on, but self-care strategies and taking care of your dental health, your digestive health, and regulating your blood sugar levels by not skipping meals or overeating are some basic 101 strategies all people should use.
You've got my attention on this subject, Dr. Brown, as I'm sure is the case for many a listener. Are there some resources that you can point our listeners in the direction of, and I can leave any web links that you provide in the description of this podcast, but are there areas that folks who want to learn more about this very important topic can look into?
Yeah, you can Google my name and type in FASD and alexithymia. I did another podcast on specific to FASD and alexithymia. If you go to Google Scholar and type in alexithymia, you're going to find thousands of hits. If you go to Amazon and type in alexithymia, there's, don't quote me on this, 5, 6, 7, 8 books that have actually been written on the topic. So that would be a starting point. Going online, reading about the Toronto alexithymia scale, providing people with my email address, because I do have literally thousands of articles that are either related to this or indirectly related to this, just sitting on my desktop that I would be more than happy to share different readings, different journal articles that have been published on it. And I know there's a few, I've taken a look at a good handful of videos on YouTube. There's other people on there that maybe have like a 7-minute video that talk about alexithymia. Good basic 101 start. None of them I found look at a forensic focus. So just take that into account. But there's a few things to think about.
And I will survey the landscape as well for some of those things you just referenced and pop those into the episode description for some quick and easy links. Hey, Jerrod, we've talked about this. Next time you come back, you're going to talk about the topic of road rage. I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you give a sneak peek for what listeners can look forward to for your next appearance on the Criminologist podcast?
You bet. So with road rage, driver aggression, whatever you want to call it, huge topic. I have talked to enough people anecdotally right now, I can't prove it with a certainty. in the era of COVID, so many people are saying people are even more aggressive on the road than they were before COVID. And if you want to weave in alexithymia, there's actually a few articles I found that it wasn't the focal point of the article, but if you dug deep into the article, there is mention that there may be a possible link between alexithymia traits and a higher incident of youth engaging in motor vehicle crashes because of difficulty identifying and describing their emotions, like someone cut them off. It's a hard time like labeling, I feel really mad right now. All that energy builds up and now they act out aggressively on the road. So we're going to talk about causes, consequences, interventions. What are some of the driving factors? It's a huge topic. And as I'm digging deeper into this topic, it has a lot of implications for a lot of people. Obviously, safety concerns. And unfortunately, many people die on the road every year throughout the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about, too, just driving while drowsy and just maybe people that have undiagnosed sleep disorders or even sleep apnea too. How might that factor into the discussion?
I am looking forward to that conversation with you, my friend. Dr. Jerrod Brown, Concordia University. Do you want to give a quick plug to your outstanding trauma, resilience, and self-care program?
You bet. My good friend and I, Janina Schick, co-teach the courses in the recently newly launched Trauma, Resilience, and Self-Care Strategies online graduate program. The first 5 classes in the program are all trauma-focused, 15 credits, 3 credits a class. Each class is 8 weeks. We take a really deep dive into the world of trauma, and that could involve the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences literature, complex developmental trauma, attachment disorders, toxic stress. We have at least 1 week I can think of off the top of my head that is specifically related to alexithymia. We talk about the impact it has on the family, on children, adults, forensic populations, even the impact it has on the professional. So definitely encourage you to take a look at that. It's a very good and multidisciplinary program. We have students in this program from all disciplines. So lots of great learning going on, criminal justice, even education, social service, human service, mental health, to name a few.
I can attest to the fact since I am enrolled in the program. And as you said, we're in class 3 of 5 now. And I've had so many moments of if I only knew then what I knew now, Jerrod. So I cannot endorse the program enough. Jerrod, we'll see you next time on the program. Thank you for joining us and talking all about alexithymia, my friend.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me back.
Big Criminologist podcast. Thank you to my friend, Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University here in St. Paul, Minnesota. Jerrod is also with APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. They are a great resource. Please check them out for some fantastic training opportunities. And I wanted to point out, I think I mentioned in the intro that there would be some Albert Fish updates. If you didn't catch the great case profile that Jerrod did back in episode 105 when we profiled the infamous serial killer Albert Fish, Jerrod and I will be teaming up with the good folks at APHIS to be bringing you a webinar doing a deeper dive on Albert Fish. So if you enjoyed episode 105, look for that opportunity to learn more. I'll be promoting it in the coming weeks. And if you haven't listened to episode 105, please go back and do so. Last week, I mentioned that we have partnered with the good folks at Libsyn Glow and have established a mechanism for you to show your support for the program. So in the description of this episode, you will see a web link, which I have now labeled Become a Supporter. Just click on that link, which reads Become a Supporter, and you will learn details of how you may show your support for the Criminologist podcast. You may become a supporter of the program for as little as $3 per month, Or you can save some money by opting to become a yearly supporter. Or if you or your agency just want to show some one-time appreciation, there's an option to do that as well. Simply a way for you to, again, show your appreciation for the show and help us offset some of our overhead cost. Hey, finally, if you are a regular listener to this program, you know that we often speak of the importance of trauma-informed care. And to that end, if you want to up your trauma game, I would recommend checking out some awesome trainings offered by my good friend, Nicole Kimberly Staley. Nicole is the owner and lead consultant of Nicole Renee Consulting, and she is offering a summer virtual training opportunity to, again, put trauma-informed theories into practice. I love the approach she's taking here. She's doing what she calls lunch and learn. These will take place the fourth Tuesday of the month at 11:30 a.m. Central Time here in the U.S. to 1 o'clock p.m. So just to give you an idea of some of the themes here, on June 23rd, which is coming up, she is going to be doing a lunch and learn, and the topic is going to be putting trauma-informed theory into practice, understanding adverse behaviors through a trauma-informed lens. Then on July 28th, the topic is going to be putting trauma-informed theories into practice, working with clients who have experienced interpersonal violence, IPV. August 25th, working with clients struggling with addiction. So check these out. What I'm going to do is I'll leave an email link in the description of this episode, an email registration link for Nicole Renee Consulting, and you can reach out and get some information on those outstanding opportunities. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We're also on Twitter at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Criminologist merchandise is available. Simply reach out for details. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
This is one of the most important topics all criminal justice and mental health professionals need to know about.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.